Good afternoon and welcome to the 2017 World Dairy Expo. Today's seminar is by Heidi Johnson at Dane County UW Extension Crops and Soil Educator. Please be sure to fill out your evaluation and turn it in at the end of the seminar. Also, do not forget to silence your cell phone. Now, let's welcome Heidi.
All right, thank you, and I am on, okay. Well, thanks for coming. You may notice that I am not Carla Hernandez. She is on the board out there. She is not here, so I am second choice, so it'll still be great though, trust me. So I am Dane County UW Extension. I'm a crops and soils educator. Does anybody know where Dane County is? You're sitting in it. It's super easy. Yes, you're sitting in it. This is Dane County. Welcome to my county. So we have a lot of dairy in this county, and we have a lot of corn silage. We have 40,000 acres of corn silage in the county. And we have a major watershed with big lakes that are in the middle of Madison. And on the edge of one of those lakes is UW-Madison, which is our flagship university that has done lots of research on those lakes, and there has been lots of evidence over time of declining water quality. So lots of concern in this watershed about phosphorus leaving farm fields and getting into the watershed. So there's a lot of interest from farmers around here in cover crops and trying to keep soil and manure from leaving their corn silage fields. So I've been doing a lot of work with it over the last couple of years, and I'm going to share with you some of my data that I've generated or things that I recommend for farmers around here. I'm also going to show you some brand new data from some of my UW-Madison colleagues that I think is pretty exciting. So I literally finished this presentation at 11:30 because I just found out I was doing this. So if there's misspellings or things in there, please forgive me because I just didn't know I was doing this until recently. So cover crops after corn silage. I hear it all the time. Who has time for that? You've got manure to put on. You've got other crops to harvest, you've got cows to milk, and then of course, if you have children like I do, they always put in other things that take away from time that you might have to plant cover crops. So I understand it's a really busy time of the year for dairy farmers. But I think that cover crops after corn silage, I would argue it's the most important crop rotation that we have in Wisconsin for us to have something covering the soil. This is ground after corn silage harvest. Obviously, not much residue there, not much left. So that lack of residue, most importantly, I think, is it leads to erosion. So leaving the soil open like that leaves it vulnerable to rain and water washing over the top and picking up soil and taking it off the field, along with manure, too, if there's been a manure application. Other less thought about things is without any residue there, there's not really anything for the microbial community to feed on. And this is not an area that we know a lot about. Soil microbes are very difficult to measure and study, but we do know that living roots provide an atmosphere for microbial community that is very important. So having that bridge for them to have something to feed on and grow on in those off times of the year is really important. Carbon cycling, also not really thought about a lot. We think a lot about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We don't think a lot about carbon, but that lack of return of carbon to the system is also not a good thing over time. So it doesn't leave a lot growing there. So also retaining nutrients from a manure application. So not only do we want to keep manure from leaving the field, but we also want to pick up things like nitrogen that might be leaching out of manure from an early application. And we might be able to save those, sponge it up with the cover crops, and then keep it over until the next year. So this is brand new data that I just got from my colleague, Francisco Arriaga. He did it just north of here at the Arlington Research Station, which is our biggest research station in Wisconsin. I think this data is really interesting, so I wanted to share it with you. This is what I literally added an hour ago. So this research was done in a continuous corn silage system. He looked at 4 management practices: conventional tillage and no-till, with cover crops and without cover crops, so 4 treatments total. And then he used a rainfall simulator, which is what it sounds like, rainfall in a square over that. He put 3 inches of rain in 60 minutes, which probably 10 years ago you would have said, oh, that never happens. That happens all the time now. So we've had several of those alone this year. So this is happening quite often to us. He did this in October, June, and April, and he measured both the water that moved off the field and he measured the soil that moved off the field. I hate when people put graphs up like this, but I have to do it to you because this is actually pretty fascinating. So on the left is the cumulative runoff depth. So that is the amount of rain that left the field, the amount of water that ran off. On the bottom is time. So we're going from 0 to 60 minutes. So that's the whole time. And the conventional till is CT, no till is NT, and then no cover crop or with a cover crop, just so you know all the symbols. So if you look in June, the no-till with the cover crop, this means that very little rain was leaving the field. So if the rain's not leaving the field, it's getting into the soil, that's where we want it. When you look at some of these all the other ones, we've got a lot of water that's leaving the field. Now, this is in millimeters. There was a total of 76 millimeters put on. So this is what's shocking to me. This is about half, or almost 50, so more than half of the water that came down left the field. And that was cut in half again when we had no-till and cover crops there. So this is just in June. If we look in October, we've got a more equal playing field, and that's because October, this is right around the time that the cover crop's getting planted. We don't have a lot growing there. It's more of an equal time of the year between all the treatments. But again, shockingly, you're losing 50 to 60 millimeters of the 76 millimeters that were applied. Then really gets interesting down in April. April, this is the cover crop treatments, the 2 of them, conventional till and no-till. Again, half of what it was in the other treatments. And if you look at this now, if you drew a line, almost all of the water that was applied to it left. So you're getting no infiltration. And this is in April. We want infiltration in April, right? That's the time we want to be getting water down into and recharging the soil. So we're losing so much water without the infiltration in those systems. This is the total runoff depth with no cover crop. This is averaging across the treatments. No cover crop and with a cover crop. The fact that these are 2 different letters above it means that they're significantly different from each other. So a lot more water left with the no cover crop system. This is sediment loss. So this is the other ones we're looking at water that left the field. This is looking at tons per hectare of soil that left the field. And again, huge difference between the no cover crop and the cover crop. So I think this data is really interesting. I've been really excited to get this from Francisco and see this because I think it shows what a big difference we're making with cover crops. So other goals that should drive your cover crop selection, a lot of times when someone's new to cover crops, they just talk to their neighbor, talk to someone that they know used cover crops. What's that guy using? Maybe I'll use some of that. I always recommend to farmers start from the beginning and think, what are really your goals for using that cover crop? And don't just use what somebody wants to sell you or what somebody said they're using. Think about what those are. So what could be your goals? Erosion control, I think, should be a minimal goal for everybody using cover crops. I think that's a really good thing that everyone should be doing, is trying to keep their soil in place. But there's these other things like growing nitrogen, growing an alternative forage. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Soil improvement, disease management. What are you after with the cover crop? And we know a lot about cover crops. Select those that try to match those goals. The issue is you may not be able to meet all your goals with your cover crop depending on what time of year that you're planting it. So you might say, well, I want to grow nitrogen. I'm going to tell you, and we'll get to this in a minute, that I don't think that that's really possible in Wisconsin after corn silage because you just don't get enough growth when you put a legume in during that time. It just doesn't grow enough to give you the nitrogen that you need for a nitrogen credit. So you may have your goals, but your crop rotation may limit your options for that. So this kind of gets to, too, how do you determine success with your cover crops, too? I just talked about nitrogen. If you're planting a legume after corn silage and you get this much growth on it and it doesn't nodulate, Have you really met your goal of growing nitrogen? No, you planted clover, but you didn't really meet that goal. So how are you also going to determine what was successful? Erosion control too, I think we need to really think about how much cover are we getting, and is that providing me the goal of preventing erosion? The data that we looked at from Francisco, one of the major benefits is that was a rye cover crop. And so rye does not die over the winter. And so we saw in April it made a huge difference because you have a living cover crop at that time of the year. If you use a cover crop that dies over the winter, you may not be meeting those erosion control goals that you have. Increasing organic matter. Hear this talked about a lot. I hear crazy numbers. Oh, you could increase your organic matter by 3% in 1 year. Probably never going to happen unless you have the worst soils that ever existed. And that's still probably not going to happen in a year. I probably could say it's never going to happen in a year. We do know from research that bad soils have a potential to increase. If you start at Arlington Research Station, which is where that other research was done, probably not going to get very far because it's beautiful black prairie ground that probably doesn't have tons of room for improvement. So if you do want to increase organic matter, you have to be reasonable about where your soil is and how long it would take you to get there. Excuse me. So this is some of my data that I generated a couple of years ago. I took cover crops planted after corn silage. They were planted on all different dates. So this is cereal rye planted on September 10th, cereal rye planted on October 10th, annual rye planted on September 10th, annual rye planted on September 23rd. You get the idea. And then I took the biomass and we were able to feed it into our modeling system that we have in Wisconsin for doing nutrient management planning. And we were able to estimate the erosion from these. And what I really wanted to show you here is that there's a big difference when you get cover crops planted a lot earlier in how much erosion you have. So this is tons of soil loss per acre. So just by changing the planting date by 1 month, you're reducing erosion by a big amount. So this is what I was talking about knowing what is success for you. If erosion control is your goal, then getting your cover crop planted as early as possible is going to give you a pretty big bang for your buck. Just for comparison's sake, you can see this is fall chisel plow with manure incorporated, and this is no-till, no-cover with manure. What I think is interesting about this is if you look at cereal rye planted late and a no-till, no-cover crop and with manure, they're about the same erosion control. I've had a lot of farmers argue with me about this, that this can't be true because cereal rye is going to grow the next spring, and our modeling system might not be taking into account for that. And I actually think that's probably accurate. But it does give you something to think about. These are drilled cover crops. So when you have soil disturbance from the drill and you only get this much growth in the fall, you've got more rougher soil that's more subject to erosion. So just a give and take thing when you talk about cover crops. So species selection for after corn silage, I already alluded to the fact that I think we have pretty limited options after corn silage. And so I'm going to give you what I think are the best options. It's really dependent on when you're going to get it planted. So in southern Wisconsin, we've found that oats and barley are options if you can get them planted really early. Why are they only options when you get them planted early? Because they don't get enough growth to provide you the residue that you need in the spring. Oats and barley are going to die out here over the winter, and they're not going to give you that residue cover unless you get a good amount of growth on them. So I like to see those planted early. In northern Wisconsin, probably just not going to happen for oats and barley. It's just not a very good option because you're not going to get enough growth on them. Why do my farmers like oats and barley? Because they die. And we're going to talk about wanting a dead cover crop in a little bit. But, and then after September 15th, and these numbers are a little bit, it depends on how long our fall is. You can give and take a little bit. I think probably up to September 20th or 25th is okay for oats and barley. But really, the later that you get, your options are gonna be wheat, rye, and triticale. And you'll notice I have certain cover crops bolded here, and that's because those are my more my favorites than the other one. I like barley because it grows faster than oats typically. It may be a little bit variety dependent, but it really grows pretty quickly. I've done side-by-sides with those, and you just get more leaf growth on the barley. So that's why that's my favorite. For the later planting, rye is just the workhorse of cover crops. It can be planted very late. It germinates late. You can get one leaf on it and it'll make it through the winter. So it's just a really forgiving cover crop. And so if you're getting into those later dates, it's really gonna be your best option. Triticale is good too. Trit is a hybrid between wheat and rye. So it's got some of the hardiness that we see in rye, but it may have a little better feed quality, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So advantages, like I mentioned, they're gonna grow in the spring and protect the soil. Disadvantages is that you're gonna have to manage them in the spring, and I will get into that. So radishes and legumes, these get talked about a lot. I think if you were to be able to plant, if silage came off really early and you were able to plant really early, these two might be options, using radishes or the clovers, but I just don't feel like we rarely, if ever, get silage off early enough for these to be worth it. When you put in radishes past the end of August, you get about a pencil size. A lot of people like radishes because they think they're breaking up compaction. If you get a pencil-sized radish, it's probably not doing that. So again, if you've got goals, then meet your goals with a cover crop. And if the radish isn't gonna get big enough to meet that goal, then it's probably not worth it. So just some pictures to show you what I mean. So this is from my plots in 2013. We planted the barley on September 9th, so a really early planting. This picture was taken from above, so it's a little hard to see how big the barley is, but it's about 14 inches tall. It got really good growth on it. And even planted that early, and even with that much growth on it, by May 28th, this is all we see for residue. So it really breaks down pretty quickly, especially with a manure application, so you wanna get as much growth on it as possible. This is a study by a colleague of mine, Matt Ruark, kind of a similar thing. His barley was planted on September 18th. Picture was taken on November 14th, and you see even less residue there. So this is why we stress the importance of getting in it early if you want to use these winter-killed cover crops. So that's all I'm going to say on species selection. We can always come back to that if you have questions. But planting methods, obviously, the drill is the go-to for planting anything, right? For cover crops, it just gives you good soil to seed contact, you get quick growth. But not everybody has a drill, and not everybody has access to a drill. So broadcast seeding is an option. You can broadcast seed and just leave the seed on the soil surface. Or you can do a tillage pass after that to try to work the seed in. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, these are post-harvest planting options. I'm also gonna talk about pre-harvest planting options too, but these are post-harvest. So obviously with broadcast seeding, you're not gonna get as good a soil to seed contact, so it's not gonna grow as quickly, and you get slower emergence. So if your whole goal is to get as much growth as possible, then by broadcast seeding, you're giving up some time in there, the time it takes for that seed to germinate and grow. Planting after harvest and a manure application can really push things pretty late too. So trying to crunch things in as tight as possible is important. All those growing degree days, all the warmth, is starting to taper off at that time of the year. Day length is tapering off. So all the things that we need to get cover crop growth is leaving slowly. So it feels like every day after silage harvest is giving up another day of cover crop growth. So it's important to try to get it planted as quickly as possible. This shows another trial that I did, just looking at different planting options and ways to plant it. Not a huge difference here. This is drilled on the left, and then this was broadcast seeded. But if you look, it's just a little bit smaller. It took it just a little bit longer time to come out of the ground. It's a little spottier. This picture isn't doing it total justice to see that it's not quite as good of a stand as you get with the drill. So late season planting, this is something that we've been trying to make work for a long time, planting when silage is getting close to harvest, just to give it a little extra time for growing. Obviously, at this time of the year, you've got a standing crop that you need to get through, so you're going to have to use some kind of specialized equipment. I think out of the 3 options there, probably the airplane is the most viable, just more options for the airplane and more experience with it. I think there's more people doing it than the other 2. One thing that's important as we've worked with this is to not plant it too early before harvest. What happens is the cover crop starts to try to grow in there and it gets really long and spindly. It has no root growth and eventually it just tips over inside of the canopy and then it's over. So a pilot that I work with pretty frequently, his recommendation to big dairy farms is when you start silage harvest, that's when I'll start seeding your fields because it takes 2 or 3 weeks on a big dairy to complete silage harvest. So you're making sure that those fields are going to come off prior to, or at least 2 weeks, at most 2 weeks after planting the cover crop. So the cover crop does look bad after you harvest the silage and it's been growing. It does look bad, but my experience now is it starts to fill in. If it looks pretty good right prior to harvest, it fills in and grows pretty well after that. I'm going to show you a picture of this too, but we were realizing an important role that slugs are playing in destroying our cover crops too. Slugs like to eat rye very much. So if you seed a field with rye, cereal rye, likely if you have slugs there, they will take it all out. So you do need to know if your field has slugs in it and something you should look at beforehand. A real scientific method here, you throw a board out in the field and you go check it the next day, turn it over and see if there's slugs hiding underneath it. So that's the best way we have for slug hunting at this point. I'll show you a picture of them. But let's get back to the seeding timing. So this is an example of what I was showing you before. This is the cover crop seeded. I don't have the dates for when the cover, oh no, I do. 9/6, the cover crop was seeded into the silage corn. This was 2 bushels of spring barley. And you can see it's standing there. And then the farmer was supposed to have gotten the silage off. He got delayed and couldn't get it off. A couple days later, you see the cover crops are starting to tip over in the canopy. So this is just an illustration of why that silage harvest is so important. And then when you've got the later harvest on the corn silage and the cover crop starts to suffer within the canopy, then obviously you're going to end up with a poorer cover crop stand too. Whereas if you get the silage off in a timely manner, you get a better stand. This picture was just taken this week. I wanted to be very open and honest about what we've been doing with aerial seeding here in Dane County. I made a big push to get farmers to seed with an airplane this year, and we coordinated a big project to do 1,000 acres with 9 farmers participating, receiving some cost share. And then the hurricanes came, and it stopped raining here, and it didn't rain for almost all of September. So this picture was just taken 2 days ago. This is one of the fields that got done, and really poor looking stand at this point. This is spring barley, and so I'm hoping that it will start to look better. We just finally got some rain this week, but I've been chewing down my nails because we're not getting any rain. And this was a big project to try to get the farmers to think about this as an option, and it's been a struggle this year. The reason I'm after this with the airplane is for that time reason. So the farmers are saying, I don't have time, I don't have time. It's just too much effort for me. The airplane did all 1,000 acres in 3 hours. So the time saved, and obviously the pilot is not a farm worker, so you're not taking one of your workers from doing something else you need to do this. It's a different use of resources. So these are slugs, and this is what they do with rye. They run through the field. It's really annoying because when you look at the rye seed, it looks like it's okay until you pick it up. They go right to the germ end because it's got all the protein in it. They eat the germ end off and they move on to the next one. So when you look at all the seeds, they look like they're there, but if you pick them up, there's a hole where they picked out the germ end, and then they don't come up, obviously. So just a little illustration, they're not easy to find. They're nocturnal, so you really have to do the board thing to be able to find them. And obviously they're the same color as the soil, so they're a little bit difficult to find, but trying to make people aware of this. tend to be around no-till situations more. Tillage disrupts them, and so if you've got no-till, it's like you do all the right thing and then you get a new pest, right? So. All right, so I don't know about where you guys are from, but here in Wisconsin, lots of interest in this early seeding of cover crops around the V5 stage in corn. And farmers are doing it a bunch of different ways, either with a modified drill or broadcast seeding, or they're going through when they're side dressing their nitrogen and putting cover crops at that point. Does it really work? I've been asked this a lot lately, and I think it has some potential for success. We've done several years of plots at the Arlington Research Station, and they've had really good luck with the red clover. That seems to be, if you followed this interseeding stuff at all, this is, Penn State has been a leader, and that's what Penn State has said, that red clover seems to have the most promise along with annual ryegrass. We haven't done a lot with annual ryegrass here. We've done more with red clover, but it does seem to have success. Cereal rye has been moderately successful. There was one year that it did negatively impact corn yield, so it got a little bit bigger and was able to compete with the corn. So, but that was 1 out of 3. Annual ryegrass, they've tried it more in northeast Wisconsin, in Brown County, but they didn't have very good success, but I think they know the reason they haven't was their herbicide program. So herbicides are going to be a big problem with this, either the herbicide you've used in the current year for controlling weeds in your corn crop that year, or even the one that you used the year before. Lots of labels aren't labeling for cover crops, so we don't really know how they're going to impact them, and it's kind of, we're learning as we go. Penn State has a nice resource out that show the cover crop, or the herbicides that work well with a cover crop program. What I'm concerned about is we are newly into herbicide-resistant weeds in this state. We have water hemp and pigweeds and the palmer showing up everywhere now, and I'm really concerned that this is going to push farmers to a glyphosate system, and I don't want to see farmers just go to glyphosate. That's what's causing the herbicide resistance problem. So that's a concern of mine as we're starting to do more interseeding. I also say, if you want to try something like this, just do it in a small area. But I say that, and then one of the farmers I work with did it on 300 acres. So they don't listen to me anyways. So. And they actually did pretty well with it. So what do I know, right? This is some pictures of the plots that we've done it as a UW system at Arlington. And this is red clover and the rye. I think that's rye. Sure. Yes, but that shows you that's a pretty good stand that they had. And then this is the farmer that I was just talking about that did the 300 acres. This is actually going to be corn silage taken off as silage, and so he had put some cowpeas in there too because he thought he could chop it with the silage. Cowpeas really suffered in the canopy. They weren't, you can see they're kind of yellow, and they should be a lot bigger than that, so they didn't do very well. But it looked pretty good. I haven't talked to them since they chopped, but I'm eager to hear how they feel it went. So, manure. What if you plant your cover crop prior to corn silage harvest? What are you going to do about manure? We've been having pretty good luck around here with putting manure right onto the standing cover crop. And farmers around here have been using airway, low disturbance injectors, and broadcast applications. You can do the airway and the LDI injections with pretty high rates of manure and still do pretty well. Probably need to keep it a little bit lower with the broadcast applications. I would say this is something that you need to do when the cover crop is not this big, because that's going to really be damaging to it. So either do it just after seeding the cover crop when it hasn't come up yet, or do it later on when the cover crop is more like 6 inches tall. I'm just giving you those recommendations out of anecdotal experience. We don't have a lot of data on this. This is somewhere I'd like to see us go with research in Wisconsin, but that's kind of what farmers around here have been doing. There was a rumor for a long time that CAFOs are not allowed to do that, and they are allowed to do that in Wisconsin, so I like to put that in so that myth will get busted one of these days, and CAFO farmers will stop thinking this. Like I mentioned, the cover crop should be big enough to tolerate the traffic. the disturbance and any coating of the leaves with the manure, so they should be a little bit bigger. But this is a really great way to take advantage of as much growing degree days as you can in the fall by planting a little bit earlier into a standing crop. Just if you have a hurricane come and you don't get any rain, you might not be the best thing to do. So this shows you, this is a cover crop that was planted after silage. This is spring barley, and this picture was taken in December. You can see the snow, and this had a airway manure application, probably of around 10,000 gallons of liquid dairy in October. So this was strip tilled. That's the strips you see, so that's not from the manure. But you can see the cover crop doesn't look really damaged at all. It looked fine. It has to recover a little bit after the application, but it looked fine after it. So this is my best picture. I never get out there to get the pictures taken at that time of the year. So termination of cover crops. Winter-killed cover crops obviously don't need any termination. And the research in Iowa show that cover crops can actually reduce your need for herbicide passes. So that's what they're claiming can be helpful down there, is that residue can help you. I don't know so much with the winter-killed cover crops because you don't have as much residue. Probably works better with the winter-surviving cover crops. So a big thing that I tell farmers to think about with the winter-surviving cover crops, so this would be the rye, the triticales, you really need to plan your termination on what you're going to be planting next. So soybeans, it just doesn't seem to be a very big deal. A lot of farmers planting soybeans after a rye cover crop and not having any issues. Same thing with alfalfa. That has always traditionally been a pretty good place. I know some farmers no-till their alfalfa into standing rye or triticale, have had really good stands and have had no issues. Until this past year, I would have said that with confidence, but I do like to tell people when I talk that this past year, or 2016, so not 17, we must have had the perfect storm of conditions where at least 6 farmers I know put a new seeding of alfalfa where there had been a rye cover crop, and this was not a standing rye cover crop, it had been burned down, but the alfalfa came up and then died. It, to me, seems like an allelopathic issue, and I'm going to talk about allelopathy in a little bit here, but that's my best guess as to what was going on with those. With $600 a bag low lignin alfalfa, I'm very hesitant now to tell farmers to go ahead and do a rye cover crop ahead of their alfalfa because that's a huge financial hit when you have a field not come up. So after speaking with a farmer that lost $10,000 this way, I'm very hesitant to recommend this. But you know, researchers that have been doing, working with rye and alfalfa for a long time have always felt like this was a good system. So I think it's just was one of those things that happened, but I think it's good that people know that it can happen. Corn, we really see more consistent issues with rye following corn, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit. Oh, I'll talk about them right now. Sorry. So this is my plots from, I think, 2014, and these were plots right next to each other. The right-hand one had a winter-killed cover crop, either oats or barley, and the one on the left had a rye cover crop. And you can see my bucket, and you can see my bucket. So it was about half the size rye in the plots that had the cover crop, the rye cover crop. We had this happen 2 years. The first year he burned the rye down, I think, 2 days before he planted the corn. Second year he burned the rye down after he planted the corn, and then he said, I'm not doing that anymore. And this last time he burned it down a month before corn planting, and we had no issues. So I know some farmers do this and have absolutely no issues at all with putting rye in or putting corn in after rye, but this can happen. Now, I do think that this may look worse than it is because I don't think that we actually see a huge yield hit. I don't know how that's possible, but we did take yield data on this field. It was yield data with a monitor on a forage chopper, which is not the most accurate. We didn't do any weighing ourselves, so we don't have that level of confidence. but it didn't look like it was a huge difference. I don't know how that's possible because the stature of the corn was a lot smaller for the entire season. But I work with another crop consultant pretty frequently that took yield data on corn for grain, and the same thing, stunting all the way through the season, but a fine yield and equivalent yield at the end of the season. So, but when we're trying to get farmers to use cover crops and you go past a field that looks half the size of the rest of your corn, and that's where you had your rye, not doing a whole lot of good for adoption of cover crops. So if you're new to rye, I just tell farmers, just kill it early, get it done early so that you don't have these issues and until you start to get comfortable with it. So I started doing research after this had happened to try to figure out why it's happening. USDA in Iowa has done a bunch of studies on this, and this is their list of recommendations for trying to not have problems with corn after rye. They recommend killing at least 10 to 14 days ahead of planting. You need to manage your residue, and basically you need to get it planted well. So a lot of times farmers new to cover crops don't have their planters set up in a way that works with cover crops. Maybe you've done no-till, but you haven't worked with cover crops before. You need to make sure that your planter is set up well to get through all that residue. Don't plant it wet. This is sometimes really hard with rye because it tends to keep the soil a little moister, but you get sidewall compaction, which can also cause a problem. Nitrogen, I think, is really important, and I've seen this with the data that I've collected too on nitrogen levels in the soil. Rye just ties up nitrogen, so that extra bump at planting may be enough to get you through that early season drag. Allelopathy, I mentioned allelopathy when I was talking about the issues with alfalfa. So allelopathy is chemicals produced by a plant that affect other plants. They think that allelopathy, the reason that a plant produces those is to protect itself against predators. But what it does is it inhibits other plants from growing. And so rye is traditionally known to be high in allelopathic chemicals and has been known to provide some weed control. So we think that this sometimes is an issue. The problem with allelopathy is it's like a ghost that you can't ever nail down because those chemicals break down very quickly in the soil under the right conditions. They're broken down by soil microbes, so if you have warm conditions with a lot of microbial activity, those are gonna get broken, they could be broken down in a matter of an hour. Or if it's cold, you have other types of conditions, they could last a lot longer. So you can't just say, I'm going to have allelopathy or I'm not. It's sort of one of those things that you never really know, and just something to keep in mind can happen. So lastly, we'll talk about cover crops as a forage. So obviously with rye and triticale, these are options to take them to the spring and chop them off as a forage. It's a good way to make your cover crops pay for themselves. So the research results, and I'm going to show some of the research results that we have here from Wisconsin, but the tonnage of the cover crop can sometimes make up for the reduction in tonnage you get from corn silage. So what I mean from that, and those of you that have grown cover crops know this, that when you take rye as a forage, it pushes back your corn silage planting date, and then you get reduced corn silage yield typically. And so I'm going to show you, and I have Kevin Shelley's data, and he's here in the audience, so I'm going to be really nervous presenting this. But you can jump up, Kevin, at any time. But the quality can be good, and I'll show you Kevin's data that he has to show what the quality of those can be. The challenges for this, obviously, is the timing of harvest of a rye forage cover crop is around about the same time that you're going to be taking first cut of alfalfa. So when resources are limited and you have to make a choice, what's a farmer going to choose, rye or alfalfa? Probably not rye. So it can, and then if you leave it there, the quality declines pretty rapidly in the field. So some farmer told me that you turn your back for 1 minute and the rye turns to crap. I think that's probably true. It goes pretty quickly. And especially if you have some wet days and can't get in there to get it chopped, it could turn very quickly. And then that impact on the following corn crop, a moisture penalty. Sometimes rye is removing moisture. If you're on sandy or shallow soils, it might create a deficit for you, and then you're also hurting your corn yield. And then the logistics of putting up a separate forage, having it in a separate bag, feeding it separately, just the whole logistics of where to put it on the farm can sometimes be an issue too. This is Kevin's data. Kevin, Shelley, and Matt Ruark did this research at Arlington Research Station, and they did this was continuous corn silage, and they had a rye. They had one with no cover crop whatsoever, and then they had with rye just as a cover crop, and then rye taken as a forage. And this is the forage yield, so you can see they did it for 5 years, and you could see this is no rye with corn silage, rye as a cover crop with corn silage, and rye as a forage. And so you see this reduction of the corn silage yield is pretty consistent across the years. And again, that's because you're getting, that one too, yep. That's pretty consistent across the years, mostly because you're getting the corn silage planted a little bit later. What Kevin and Matt were interested in is, does the rye forage that you get make up for that? And you can see in a lot of cases, it gets pretty close. The total forage that you get between the corn silage and the rylage, to put them together equates typically more than what you're going to get with just the corn silage. But then the issue is forage quality, right? So rye is not going to be the same forage quality as corn silage. They did run all the data on this, and you can see I am not a nutritionist in any way, shape, or form, so I'm not even going to pretend to get through all those other numbers. I can do relative feed quality. I'm comfortable with that one, so that's where I'm going to stick. I put everything else up here so you can look at it. But you can see that there's a big difference in the feed quality from year to year. And this could be because of harvest date, when you're getting the rye off. Obviously, we just talked about that. That's an issue. So it's a little inconsistent. Kevin and I have actually did some focus groups with farmers and nutritionists this last year, and we've been showing them this data. And we've had a lot of different reactions to this about which group of animals would you feed this to? Would you be happy about this? And it's been kind of interesting to hear what their reaction is to it. And Kevin is here, so if you have questions about this research project, he could always answer them afterwards. Triticale is something that we don't know as much about in Wisconsin, at least from a research perspective. So I stole some research from New York. The reason that New York is pushing it a little bit more is they feel that Triticale offers you a little bit more forgiving harvest window. So it typically matures a little bit later, and so you get a longer harvest window to try to get it harvested. The problem for us in Wisconsin is if the rye harvest date pushes corn silage planting back too far, then certainly the Triticale harvest date is going to push it back too far. So it doesn't really solve that issue for us, but it does open up a bigger window for us to take it off as a forage. And the tonnage can be probably as good or better than rye, possibly. Again, we don't have side-by-side data. This is Tom Kilser's data out of New York. And he shows about 6 tons of dry matter if you get the Triticale planted early, and then more like 4.5 to 5 if you get it planted a little bit later. So he pushes an early planting window. This would be a stretch for us in Wisconsin, and New York probably has a couple weeks on each end extra of a season than we do. They get just that much more than we do, which probably makes a big difference for them too. But again, if we look at RFQ, which is what we were looking with on the rye, this looks a little bit more consistent, and that may have to do with that extended harvest window that you get. Farmers in Wisconsin, in this area, nobody uses Triticale. I know one farm that does. In the northeast of Wisconsin, in the Big Dairy region by Green Bay, more farmers are using Triticale, and that seems to be a more favorable feed. So what do farmers think about feeding cover crops? This is what I just referred to. Kevin and I have been doing these focus groups, and we did 2 in northern Wisconsin and 2 in southern. We asked farmers, cattle nutritionists. I gotta check my time, okay. And each group had about 8 people in it, and we had about 3 or 4 farms represented. We tried to get farms with their matching consultants, so we tried to get their nutritionists and their agronomists so that we could get a whole picture of what these farms are doing. We tried to get equal amounts of farmers that were using cover crops as a forage and those that weren't. We are just barely getting into, we recorded all these focus groups, we got them transcribed, and now we're reading through them trying to come up with similar things that all the farmers said. So this is just some very preliminary results. But I think most of what we heard is what we expected. Why are they using cover crops? A lot of them said they were preventing erosion, nutrient scavenging, and then this public relation thing came in. A lot of them said that the public likes to see green fields. It makes them feel good. It makes people feel good that farmers are doing something about erosion and manure, and so it is a public relation piece that they recognize as something important. Some of them, though, really liked the forage, and they felt that it was a particularly valuable heifer feed for them, especially those that were tight on land and wanted to double crop. This was what they saw as a really valuable piece. What do they identify as challenges? Like I said, rye turns into bad feed very quickly. One of them said, then you have a whole pile of bad feed. That's not what he said, but it was close to what he said. He said you have a whole pile of something. So what they pretty much said is if it goes too late and it's bad, then you have a lot of it and you don't know what to do with it. If you get it off on time and it's really good, it runs out too quickly and you wish you had more. So it's almost like it's emotionally challenging for them too. Time, obviously, we knew that's going to be a big issue in spring to make the forage, in the fall to get it planted. One of the farmers said, I don't know, by the time I get done with silage harvest and get my manure out, I just don't want to deal with it. And I get that. That's something to think about too. And then all these problems with the following corn silage crop. Corn silage is obviously a very important part of the feeding system. And so giving up anything with that is challenging and not something that farmers want to do. And these are some of the things that they said were issues. They can't get it planted soon enough, their corn silage, because they have rye out there. The ground is staying too wet. They're having problems planting back into the cover crops. It's the rye fibrous root system from the rye is difficult to get into. Armyworms were brought up as a pest problem. And then other pests came up too. And then the moisture depletion came up as well. The soil loses too much moisture from the rye, and they need that for their corn silage. So more to come on that one. I think it was really interesting to hear what they had to say. So everybody wants to know cover crop economics, and this is a challenging one for all of us that work with cover crops because we don't have the numbers that people want from us. People want to know the total economics for this, and I can't give you that because it's difficult to quantify them. What I can give you is some basic seed costs and basic planting costs, and these are the hard costs that we know that it's going to cost to use a cover crop. There's options to wiggle these in any different direction. I mean, a lot of farmers growing bin-run cover crops now. That's becoming more and more popular as you get into cover crops. You just start growing your own, and you can save significantly on planting costs. Of course, you got to clean your seed, and then there's other things that come in with that, but that is an option for reducing the cost. And then if you've got your own equipment, then you're going to be saving some of these other planting costs as well. The airplane, although it's a really nice option, it can get expensive. $20 an acre is just an average, but it depends on how far you are from the airport, how much the pilot likes you. I don't know. It can get expensive depending on the situation. Oh, one option though, the reason we did this big project with aerial seeding this year is if you can give a pilot a lot of acres, he's much more apt to give you a better price. So if you can pool together resources and get a bunch of farmers to do it, that's an option to get your costs down. These are the fuzzy numbers that farmers really want to know. Well, what are the long-term beneficial economics of cover crops? I can give you these numbers. You can reduce erosion, and you've got a nutrient equivalent for tons of soil loss. You've got water quality costs, reduction in land value when you have erosion, but those are all kinds of fuzzy things that I can't tell you what those are going to be because I don't know what all your fields are. So you would have to know that on a field-by-field basis. In Wisconsin, we use a nutrient management planning tool called SNAP Plus, which estimates erosion, And so farmers around here, to show the difference that they're making, they're able to input their traditional management system, and then they're able to input their management system with cover crops, and they know on a field-by-field basis how much erosion they're reducing by, and then that gives them some value for that reduction in erosion. But every farmer would have to do that on their own. That's not a general thing that we can give. Increase in organic matter, I'm sure you've all seen these crazy numbers of the value of organic matter. Raising it by 1% has $684 worth of nutrients in it. But again, I can't give you a general, if you use cover crops, in 2 years, you're gonna reduce by 1% organic matter. There's no way I can do that for you. And if anybody tells you they can do that for you, they are liars, because there's no way. There's no way to know that. It's gonna be on a field-by-field basis. I mentioned that we feel like in Wisconsin, the worse your soil is, the further you could go. But if you start off with really good soil, the chances of you improving it are probably less, which feels very defeatist, but don't be defeated. I think there's still benefits to it. There's also all these soil microbial community, mycorrhizal fungi things that everybody's talking about. I think there's benefits to those, but can I tell you what those benefits are? No. We do know that using cover crops increases your microbial community. We know that. Does that microbial community work for you? We don't know that. That's the problem. Does it give you something back? We don't know that. We know there's changes, but we don't know exactly what those are over time. So it's an area that every scientist that works in cover crops is just chewing at the bit to try to figure out these benefits and costs of cover crops, but it's really challenging to do. So I'm in Dane County, UW Extension, my number, my email, and I manage a website for Wisconsin cover crops, and I will take any questions. Yes, sir.
Okay, for manure application on cover crops, have you guys found out what you would lose in manure by not being able to incorporate it versus?
From a nitrogen perspective?
Yes.
No, I haven't, but I think that's worth doing. Yeah, not specifically with cover crops. I mean, we know, we have research with, top of five.
If you don't incorporate manure, you lose a lot.
Right.
With the cover crops growing, you can't really incorporate it.
Right, exactly. And I think you do improve infiltration when you've got it, so liquid manure may infiltrate a little bit quicker, but yeah, I mean, there's so many like, oh, you do that, and then you get slapped with that. It seems like that it's never perfect, So I do think that's gonna be something that we need to look at more carefully.
So then on the same line, when you're talking about incorporating manures versus throwing it on a cover crop,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what's the value of incorporating manure when that soil covers up and ties up that part of that nitrogen that's going to leach away anyways if there's no plant growing up there? I mean, it volatilizes in the plant that's growing.
Yeah.
And if it gets covered up by the soil, does it really matter?
So you're saying that the cover crop, taking it up, it's gonna get lost anyways?
Well, that nitrogen that we're concerned about, if it's nitrate or.
Yeah. Well, if it gets taken up into the cover crop, it at least is kept there in,
That's what I'm saying. So any application of your animal waste, if it's liquids or solids or whatever, is going to be taken up, that type of nitrogen, that volatile, is
Yeah.
going to be taken up.
well, but I think it's gonna be taken up, it's gonna volatilize more quickly than the cover crop can take it up. So if you just truly,
Yeah, but
over the
even
top.
if it's incorporated in the soil, it
Yeah.
makes it in the soil in October.
Yeah.
Without nothing on it,
Yep.
it's going to leak.
yes, yeah, that's true. I got you now. Yep, that's true.
So
Yep.
that's how I look at it.
Yep. I do worry a little bit. So radish has been sold as this huge nitrogen accumulator. It does accumulate a lot of nitrogen, but it decomposes so quickly in the spring that our Wisconsin research shows that it's gone before the corn could ever use it. So I do worry a little bit about us advertising that cover crops are saving the nitrogen if actually it's just getting lost at a different time of the year. So I think that's something to think about too. There's interest now in combining radishes with things like rye, so you get the release of those from the radish, but it gets taken up by the rye and it's still kept there. But that's an issue too, that are we just losing it at a different time of the year, but we feel better because we had radishes growing there? That's not really helpful. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the importance of deliberate planning.
Mm-hmm.
When you sit down with a neophyte and someone who is just ready to explore the advantages of cover crops, how many years you tell them this is what you're going to have to program? Not, seat of your pants. This is the way you're going to work through the rotation on that field. What time frame would you tell them?
Well, typically if it's a dairy farm, they're gonna know what their rotation is. They're gonna have that planned out. Around here we do 4 years of corn silage and then we do a couple years of alfalfa. So that's pretty standard, 3 years of corn silage and then 4 years of alfalfa, something like that. So that in that kind of situation, they know they're going to be doing corn silage there for a couple of years. I don't think that you necessarily need to plan out a long time your rotation because the rotations here are just not that diverse. You're either a grain farmer and you're using corn and soybeans, maybe wheat, or you're a dairy farmer and you're doing corn silage and alfalfa. So it's not that wild. I do think the decision to incorporate wheat opens up a huge new window for us to use cover crops in a way that could help us improve soil condition over time, gives us an opportunity to grow legumes and produce nitrogen to save money on our corn crop, and just introduces some more diversity into a very non-diverse system. So I do think a decision to use wheat could be very helpful, and I have farmers that I work with that have introduced wheat. They feel over the long-term rotation, the introduction of wheat and the use of cover crops has improved all the yields on every crop in their rotation. So it's worth it for them to grow wheat, even though wheat in itself is not a moneymaker. But for dairy farmers, pretty straightforward what their rotation is gonna be. I thought you were gonna go to a place which is how many years do you have to use cover crops before you start to see benefits? And I read your mind. So I strongly feel it is a 5 to 10 year commitment with no-till and with cover crops to start to see that you get comfortable with what you're doing, you get the equipment down right, that you've got equipment dialed in to the point where you know what you're doing and you know adjustments to make when things could go wrong, and where you relax enough that you don't run out there with your chisel plow because things look bad. So I do think it's a growing time for the farmer and then for the soil to get to the place where it functions well. When you switch it to no-till or to cover crops, it's sort of slapping it in the face, and it takes some time for that microbial community to change and the whole system to come into play. So I'm pushing, instead of us always cost sharing cover crops for a year, let's lock people into a 5-year commitment so they feel like they'll do it for a while and then they know what they're doing by that 4th or 5th year. So, yes?
I think you're recommending something like 70 pounds of nitrogen in 20.
Mm-hmm.
Right. What about later season application then? Does that rye break down? You get the nitrogen back?
I don't find it coming back out. I've done nitrate sampling up until July, and I don't see it coming out. Other researchers have done it later, and the prediction is that it probably comes out after tasseling. What I think happens, though, over time is it's this whole thing where you use them and your soil starts to get more residue and you get more slow breakdown of things over time. So I think after doing it for a while, you probably get more release. Those numbers are more for, hey, I'm using cover crops the first time and I want to make sure I have a good corn crop. So over time, I think you could probably back off on that. And I have a farmer I work with that has been doing cover crops now, I think, for 10 years. And he did some strips with really reduced nitrogen rates with his corn and really has some amazing results of how far, I think he backed it down to like 60 pounds total and that he applied and still had good yields. And they're not great soil. So it was, I think there's chances to do that, but he has wheat in his rotation and he uses diverse cover crop mixes, and so it's a system that you can get to, but for first year in, don't short yourself on the nitrogen. Mm-hmm.
Is there any other organizations, agencies like USDA, NRCS, DNR, town board, water sanitation district, anybody else that's incentivizing farmers when it comes to cover crop?
Well, in Dane County, we are. We have a farmer-led watershed group here that called Yahara Pride Farms, and they've been raising their own money and cost sharing, $40 an acre for cover crops for the last 5 years now. And I think they started off the first year, they cost shared 1,000 acres, and now they're cost sharing like 2,500, but they're getting an additional 3,000 acres the farmers are doing on their own. So definitely, it's a huge thing right now in Dane County that we're discussing. There's some significant pressure on farmers to make changes. There's a lot of water quality monitoring going on, and there's a lot of finger pointing going on. So it's becoming a huge hot button issue right now, and I think we'll see some more innovative means to fund cover crops in the future like they're doing in Chesapeake Bay. All right, everybody ready to grow some cover crops? Yay! Thank you.